Welcome to this session at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, a session on whether good ideas equals bad politics. I'm Anne Mossop from the Opera House and I'm your chair this afternoon, and we have a terrific panel here. Elizabeth Farrelly, Waleed Ali, Miriam Lyons and Annabelle Crabb. What I'll be doing is just introducing the speakers and setting out a little bit about what we might want to talk about. We'll be hearing from each of the speakers and we'll have some time for discussion amongst ourselves and also to welcome you to join in the discussion. There are 2 microphones in the audience for later on if you've got something that a dangerous idea to throw out from the floor. So we're looking forward to having that discussion with you a bit later. We've got 4 speakers with us this afternoon who can talk about this topic from very different points of view. In a way that I hope will enable us to build up a picture about that relationship between ideas and politics, whether ideas and politics in fact don't mix, whether this matters. Since we started thinking about it, of course, the political landscape has shifted dramatically, and perhaps we're hoping to find out this afternoon whether that's actually going to mean more chance of ideas actually surviving the political process or not. It seemed to me that there were some interesting questions to ask. Are we comfortable with ideas, let alone dangerous ones, which of course is what we're thinking about at this festival? What do our political parties make of them? How do government deals with them? What happens to ideas as they are transformed into policy and then become the business of government? Do they flourish? And what about politicians of ideas? Are ideas in fact an electoral liability for the people that we elect to govern us? Our first speaker this afternoon is Elizabeth Farrelly. She's a Sydney-based writer. Many of you would know her from her long career of writing very interesting architectural criticism in the Sydney Morning Herald and elsewhere. But she's somebody who's moved out from that base of her original discipline to write more broadly about social issues in, I think, a very interesting way, and somebody who's not afraid of putting a controversial point of view or tackling the kind of preconceptions with flair and wit. We're going to be hearing then from Waleed Ali. Some of you will have heard him talk earlier this afternoon. Lawyer, political scientist at Monash University, somebody who we see writing, speaking about issues like Islam, racism. His first book, People Like Us, was published in 2007, and his recent quarterly essay, What's Right? The Future of Conservatism in Australia, was something that perhaps held the seed for this discussion in terms of his talking about whether our politics in fact is an entirely tribal business or whether there is actually space for ideas. Miriam Lyons is the Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Development, a public interest think tank, and she was previously the Policy Coordinator for New Matilda. So somebody who has a real role in bringing these kinds of ideas into public discussion. She's one of the editors of More Than Luck, a collection of really fantastic essays put together just prior to our recent election to look at some of those. The subtitle of it is Ideas Australia Needs, I beg your pardon. So something where a fantastic selection of writers have looked at a whole lot of ideas across the spectrum from health to human rights and how those could in fact be part of the political process. Annabelle Crabb probably needs a little introduction from me. Somebody who has been a journalist with The Advertiser, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, and now with ABC Online. I think, as with many of you in a Sydney audience, probably first noticed Annabelle's writing in the 2000 election, where you really saw how somebody could write about politicians and their foibles with incredible wit and humour and poisonous barbs, but at the same time take their ideas and their politics and their policies very seriously, which is a most enjoyable combination. So Annabelle will be speaking last of our speakers. So first I'll hand over to Elizabeth Farrelly to set the context for us. I was prompted to ask her when I read a piece of her writing about Australia as a country where anti-intellectualism is perfectly acceptable, where ideas can, possibly be embarrassing, where we don't take education seriously. So we'll ask her to set the context for this conversation. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen and others. We both know who you are. but don't worry, your secret is safe. I want to talk about the dangers of intellectual tribalism. And it strikes me that I'm a bit of a slow learner in this. How I know that is going back. When I was a child, I happily supplemented my intellectual diet with a steady and secret stream, I might say, of fairy tales and mythology of one kind or another, in which I was addicted to the battle of evil, against evil, I guess, but by essentially courage, and the way that courage became the winning virtue. Courage was what got you to the sort of shiny bits, I suppose, at the end. And so I was particularly thrilled when later on, probably 20 years after that, I got to London to live, and I was poor and cold and for a little while unemployed. And I remember, those of you who have lived in London or who lived there during the Thatcher years, which when this was, would remember those signs that said, "Take courage," in the sky. They're neon signs. Of course, it was advertising beer, which I didn't realise at the time. But I thought they were really sweet. I thought they were aimed at me personally, and they rather helped. So I had the distinct impression, that is, that courage was a good thing, which is possibly why it took me some years of living in Sydney before I realised that when people said to me, as still sometimes they do, "Oh, that's brave," they didn't mean it as a compliment. What they actually meant was, "Oh, very good, yeah, here we go, think outside the herd at your peril, lady." Always accompanied, of course, by that little snigger that adds, you think you're clever, but we actually know that you're an idiot, and we'll happily sit here and watch you take the fall. But the thing that struck me then and strikes me now is that I wasn't actually even being brave. I was just being honest, saying, that is, what I thought about, art, planning, politics, and general stuff. What I hadn't realised at the time was that you do that at your peril, and at the risk, in fact, of your professional future, which I discovered too late, as you do. Clever, too, the word clever has also become, I think, a word of derision. To be clever means to be a serial breacher of that most profoundly Australian of faiths, which is equality. This whole thing always surprises me about, still surprises me about Sydney and about Australia generally, partly because I think my image of Australia and Australia's reputation generally is of being so buffy and robust and, independent and sort of stringy. And partly because when I first came to Sydney, it didn't seem at all like that. It seemed intensely and immensely and enchantingly creative. But that was well before I came to live here, I might say. And after that, I lived several years in London, which I thought, not least by contrast with Sydney, was one of the ugliest places on earth, and cold, and all of those terrible things. And in those years, of course, people used to sleep generally on the streets. I think almost everybody used to sleep on the streets, it seemed to me. When you walk into Camden Town tube station and you had to sort of step over bodies, I thought of them as Margaret Thatcher's bodies. Anyway, but what made it worth it was, of course, that there were ideas in the air. Ideas were currency, and newspapers were brilliant, and politics was interesting, and just watching the cut and thrust of the debate was fabulous. It wasn't just politics. I mean, you could say, I remember architecture critics who would say, so-and-so never was any good, and this is the worst thing he's done yet, and nobody sued. So I was really shocked to find, so the first thing that anyone said to me in Sydney was, you better watch out, because you'll be sued, because architects are really delicate. And my experience on coming to Sydney after all of that was first of all, I thought, I know what I'll do. I'm a wee bit bored. I'll do a PhD, as you do. Thinking that'll be some intellectual stimulus. I'll stretch my mind a wee bit here. I couldn't have been more wrong. Not only could I not find anyone who even understood the topic which I wanted to do, which I thought was pretty simple. It was like something like the relationship between modernism and individualism. That's pretty obvious. And everyone went like, what? And so I ended up being, really, really boring and doing something about, you might not see the connection here, and I didn't either, how high-rise buildings came to Sydney. And I thought, well, this is what happens to you in academia. You get twisted into this really sort of pedestrian, untheoretical, un-ideas-oriented mode. But I thought, never mind, we'll make the best of this, and I will find what the ideas were behind the tall buildings in Sydney and the transformation of Sydney from that 12-storey thing that you can still see as a tide mark around Sydney into skyscraper land. So I dug away and was surprised, first of all, to find that nobody else had done it first. There was no history written about any of this stuff, nothing. So I was looking at, piles like this of committee notes and scanning them scrutinising them for any ideas at all. And eventually, after some years of this, I realised there actually weren't any ideas. Not one, to tell you the truth. There was lots of rationalisation, which was to do with the tallest fire ladder and the longest fire hose, and lots of intricate discussion about how many extra inches you needed on a fire hose to reach the top of a building. But of course, the longest possible fire hose was all of about, 150 feet, which, so the minute you got beyond a 12-storey building, even 15 stories was well beyond the reach, so it didn't make any difference. And people talked about, whether you could jump off the building in a fire or not, and stuff like that. But all of which was totally irrelevant. But entire parliaments were occupied by this stuff for years until they finally banned them in 1912 and made them illegal for the next 50 years. But for no reason, which was really interesting, whereas New York, which had dozens of reasons to ban skyscrapers, mainly because people had got killed in them regularly, or at least got killed in tenements, which was seen as being the same thing. And they let them happen. So, there you go. But at least the discussion, it was noticeable that the discussion in the New York case, which was going on pretty much simultaneously, was full, absolutely full of ideas and really reasoned argument. It was quite a shock. Then I had, about the same time, I made the mistake of being persuaded to enter politics, local politics, for a bit in the city, thinking, we could do some urban design here. And I remember being booed off the stage in my first ever political speech because I tried to explain, I tried to talk about urban design. I thought it was pretty simple. People wanted to have a nice city, didn't they? So this is how I thought we might do it. And I actually was booed to the point of just about tears, I might say. But so never into politics is the obvious answer. But that sort of stuff, that was almost, not quite 20 years ago. But since then, I've had children, and I'm shocked to see that at primary school you have sports where every single person who participates gets not just a certificate but a trophy, and but nevertheless, later in the elite levels of sport, or even the less elite, of course, you're required to be elitist about it and to be shamelessly excellence-seeking. Try and do that, however, in the intellectual department, forget it. You use, every time I use big words in my column, I get letters from people who say things like, you think you're so clever, but... and they don't have to be that big, it's like 3 syllables, it's not... And I remember being told by an editor, if you use words like postmodernism, you have to explain what you mean. I think, where do you start? So... but I have to say, I don't think anyone ever attacked Cathy Freeman saying, you think you're so fast, My daughter's school newsletter has congratulations for every single child on everything they ever do, be it chess, debating, swimming, you name it, they get congratulated, with a single exception of when you get into a selective school, no one mentions it. It's like it didn't happen. If you get a scholarship, forget it. It's like that whole exam thing, this is year 6, nobody even talks about it. And you ask the teachers and you get this frozen kind of, whoa. This is in a school with an OC. Premier's reading challenge, I think, is the same, where you get like 6 months to read 20 books, which can have pictures, can be graphic novels, which are essentially comics. They can be, Agatha Christie's on the list, but in the abridged version. So I don't know, reading challenge, you have to see the challenge in quotation marks here. It seems to me it's a system designed to reward the kind of trappings of intelligence, but at the expense of the real thing. Because those sorts of systems actually, bright kids who go through that system see how easy it is to manipulate, and not only that, but how they actually get rewarded for manipulation, which totally undermines their faith in that system. And it's no surprise to me to find that there's that recent stuff that came out, I think, last week about how the school system, the focus on basic skills, I think they're called, has actually undermined the performance of the bright children in classes. That's actually declined by international standards. And in the same week, we have news that Australia's universities have also been dropping, in some cases quite dramatically. Sydney Uni, my alma mater, dropped from 36th to 71st in a single year, which of course they don't think is reasonable. And I would like to defend them if I could, but when you look at academia, it's perfectly clear that, with all due respect, there are, to my esteemed colleagues, that they've been swept by this fashion for turning bogan culture into serious intellectual fare. And people do PhDs on things like, video games and V8 racing and web porn, as a sort of staple diet. It's not even, chic any longer or fringe. It's actually standard. I went, for example, to a talk by Ziggy Swikowski the other night, about 3 days ago at Sydney, who was talking about nuclear power and why it's such a good idea, of course. I thought at first that he had misjudged his audience because he did this wide sweep of the technological fix from about 1810 onwards and why it's been so brilliant. And then I thought, actually, probably he hasn't misjudged his audience. Probably that really general propaganda is what everybody now expects, even though nearly all the people were either lawyers or academics or both. And I was really surprised that it was a shameless tirade in favour of nuclear power. It wasn't actually an argument, didn't deal with the question of waste, for example. Anyway, blah, blah. When I criticise McMansions, as I do every now and then when I'm feeling brave, I am reliably deluged by angry emails from academics, quite often, whose life's work it is to defend these, because people in academia now do this tribal thing where they take a position and then they spend the whole rest of their academic life defending that position. And if the McMansion, or suburban sprawl, shall we say, is what you're defending, then whatever happens, you just defend it regardless. And so I get these angry, hot under the collar emails, but what they essentially say is, McMansions are okay, it's elitist to criticise them because that's what everybody wants. As if that's a reason that makes it okay. So, anyway. You try and write a book. If you talk to a publisher of any of the big publishers these days, other than the kind of, tiny presses, you'll get publishers who say to you, yeah, that's all very well, feminism, yes, sure, interesting, but you want to sell, you write about crime or cooking. That's how this country runs. That's the rule, So, that's what you do. We have hospitals where every doctor signs a confidentiality agreement, so if you want any debate about the medical system, forget it, because the confidentiality isn't to do with the patient-doctor relationship, it's to do with the doctor-hospital relationship. Lawyers and architects are similar. They will avoid saying anything publicly. Around the dinner table, sure, but public discussion is almost nil. I think in politics this translates into stuff which I'm sure we'll cover quite soon with my colleagues, but which allows, the coal lobby to write our greenhouse policy, which leaves it to BHP to suggest that we have a carbon tax, notwithstanding that BHP, of course, owns the world's biggest uranium deposit, and so on. It seems to me that intellectual tribalism, which runs through everything that we do and think, puts genuine intelligence in the bin, because genuine intelligence, and yes, this is a question of definition, cannot be forced into those truth-twisting behaviours. My submission to you is that no other minority would tolerate this kind of oppression, and yet it's happening, ironically, at a time when we could hardly have needed an intelligentsia more. Our future survival depends as a species, I believe, on our status as big-brain monkeys, just as it always has, but even more than it always has. And I fear that the future will look at us, that is to say Australia, shake its head and say, how is it that this culture that pretended to revere excellence made its own intelligentsia into the last minority that dare not speak its name? This, they'll say, I fear they'll say, is how Australia kept itself stupid. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll now hand over to Waleed to take up the cudgels on behalf of those who come from inside universities and also on behalf of those who might perhaps prefer to be watching the AFL Grand Final this afternoon than talking about ideas. Waleed.
Thank you. Really tempted now to do a 10-minute dissertation on comic books. And I could. I was actually toying with the idea of introducing a first-year politics subject at Monash on the politics of Batman. And tell you what, that would have been an extraordinary subject. And it would have worked. And one of the reasons it would have worked is because when you deal with a comic book character, you can actually discuss ideas much more easily than when you're dealing with real people. Once you are dealing with real people, then all sorts of emotional investments get in the way. So, for example, I could use Batman and the Joker to talk about terrorism in a way that I simply cannot talk about terrorism when I'm talking about terrorism. Because you have an abstract idea that you can then access and you can then discuss and begin to unpack. And that is, I guess, what academics do. I'm pleased to hear criticism of academics for not being theoretical. Where I come from, that's the number one criticism of academics. Far too theoretical. Concerned about theory. You don't live in the real world. You don't deal with policy that actually affects people's lives. You deal with ideas. And
I think they're the same thing.
I would wear that as, and they are. I'd wear that as a badge of honour. I want to make the observation that you live in a country that is really born of an idea that we don't even talk about. The very structures of the government that so affects our lives, although we did live 2 weeks without it, I guess that was okay. But these structures are actually the scribblings of academics from hundreds of years ago that have created these structures. Things that you take for granted, like the rule of law, like the separation of powers, like freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of these things that you take for granted or indeed wish to erase, as the case may be. These all began as ideas, often very radical, dangerous ideas. And so even in a country and a public, with a public as bereft of ideas as ours, and I do accept that that is a fair characterisation of Australian public discourse, even in a nation like ours, we're so inevitably influenced by them, even if we don't realise it. Now, in Australia's case, it's largely because we didn't have much choice. We just inherited a lot of this from Britain, where those debates had taken place. Britain's an interesting case. They had an election earlier in the year, also resulted in a hung parliament. One of the things that was fascinating about it, I think I was about to do a presentation at the night before the election. I thought I'd see what had been said, and I happened to click on a website of a think tank in the UK that had recorded a panel quite like this. And one of the people on the panel was Philip Blond, who is, of course, the self-described red Tory, who's pushing this idea of progressive conservatism, which those of you who were in the previous session I was involved in would know that that's just a flat contradiction. But anyway, and that's not an insult, they're just opposite terms. That's what they mean. But nonetheless, what was fascinating about this, Philip Blond's an important figure because he's been very influential over David Cameron. And one of the things that was fascinating about listening to this conversation, it was him and it was John Gray, who's a political philosopher, conservative political philosopher, and a range of other people, was they actually mentioned people like Edmund Burke and John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Hayek. And they even mentioned Margaret Thatcher, but not simply as a politician, as someone who was a prosecutor of an idea. And that's what she was. One of the points that John Gray made in that conversation was that Margaret Thatcher is very much, and was undoubtedly, a progressive. That was what she was trying to do, was remake society in pursuit of some ideal vision. That's what progressivism is, and that's what she was. And I listened to this and thought, I don't think I could find this anywhere in Australia, in a way that was so public, in a way that led us right to influential people over those who have the highest offices in our country, or who want them. Whatever you think of Philip Blond, and there's lots of people who don't like Philip Blond, whatever you think of him, he's engaged in ideas. He's a political philosopher, essentially, and he has the ear of the person who is now the Prime Minister of Great Britain. I don't know which political philosopher is most closely aligned to Julia Gillard. I don't know who speaks to her that is a political philosopher. You might think that's a wonderful thing, because it takes ideas and ideology and the sort of the inherent tribal warfare that ideology tends to produce out of politics. You're entitled to that view. Everyone's entitled to have a stupid opinion. That's fine. I'm just joking. But I would argue, no. Politics matters because of the ideas that animate it. And when you remove those ideas from politics, what you have is something that is barbaric. Even though it's true that some ideas are barbaric. I heard Bob Carr responding to this election campaign that we had. There's a lot of people criticising this election campaign because there was no vision in it. And Bob Carr's response, you probably know this better than me, because I was probably received more coverage here than in Melbourne, where I'm from, was that, well, if you want vision, go read Mein Kampf. His argument was that vision isn't always a good thing, and that's true, and ideas are not always useful. I understand that. But that's a little bit like arguing that, well, if you want stability, go to communist China, as an argument that stability is therefore a bad thing. I think it's a poor sort of argument to make. Ideas are really what's animated politics, made politics interesting, and made politics influential and important. When politics enters a managerial phase, it becomes less important, even though it becomes more dominant in our public lives. And for a long time, our politics, even in Australia, has been animated by ideas. The Labor Party was a party based on an idea, a set of ideas about collectivism, for instance, about the role of the state, about the importance of trade unions, about the rebalancing of power relationships between an elite and between the working class. That's what the Labor Party was about. I don't think you have to be a Labor Party historian to identify that. The Liberal Party, at least as Menzies perceived it, was the party of the individual, not necessarily a conservative party. Menzies was quite clear on that. But it was a party for free trade, with some government assistance, but the dignity of the individual. Ideas, two separate ideas. To vote for one of these parties was to vote for a vision of what the state should be, what the state should do. It was to ask you to buy into a worldview. And this division between capital and labour, the individual, the collective, these were divisions that played themselves out in politics all over the world. There are a lot of countries that have a contest, a political contest between a version of a Conservative Party and a Labor Party. For that reason, there are ideological divisions. All of that ended, I think, really with the end of the Cold War. Because the Cold War was the ultimate ideological contest. Those who want ideological politics definitely got their fix in the Cold War. It was all about ideas. And then it ended. And so what you had was this weird phase in politics where Labor parties started to realise, well, the ideological contest is over, we'll start speaking as though we're Liberal parties. And they did. Who were the great architects of liberal economic reform in Australia? Hawke and Keating. It was the Labor Party. It was controversial because it was the Labor Party that did it. But they did this because really what you had after the Cold War was this emerging worldwide consensus that free markets, capitalism, and the idea of an individual over collective really is the philosophical disposition that we should be taking. that consensus, I would argue, has meant that ideas don't really emerge in politics anymore. If you find it difficult to tell the major parties apart, it's because they are difficult to tell apart, because it's hard to identify what the animating philosophies of them are. The Liberal Party, I guess, still is a little bit clearer, particularly economically. But what's the Labor Party about? It can't really be about the collective anymore, because we don't do the collective. That's not what our politics is about. The sad thing, I think, is that means that there is nowhere for politics to go really other than managerialism. One of the things I found most concerning about the 2004 election, when we were in the middle of a war in Iraq that wasn't going terribly well, to put it mildly, was that we had an entire election campaign based around interest rates. Interest rates are important to a lot of people, I understand that. But what was the idea at the base of that election campaign? I would argue the idea was that we live in a company, and as long as the balance sheet looks pretty good and the figures are good, then we should re-elect the board.